Well, we read a little bit earlier in the service the short letter from the Apostle Paul to Philemon, and if you've got a Bible with you, perhaps you can open it in that passage. I was thinking originally, at least until this week, of perhaps continuing with Elijah for another couple of weeks, because even though we looked at the chariots of fire and the way that he was taken up last week, there are some references in the scriptures to Elijah afterwards. But then looking again this week and thinking about it, I thought, well, the chariots of fire are probably a good way to say goodbye to Elijah. So we'll leave it there for now. And so I wanted to do something a bit different this morning. The holiday season is just around the corner. I'm sure many of you are looking forward to your holidays. In fact, one or two of our number have gone already. And Rob and Jane are down in Cornwall enjoying the sunshine, I'm sure, down there this morning on the beach or whatever it is they're doing. And I wanted to look with you this morning at one of the postcards that we find in the New Testament. There are three of them, really. 2 John, 3 John, and the book of Philemon. Really, you could call them postcards because they're so short that they fit onto just one side of a piece of paper in our Bibles. They're just a very brief message. And I wanted to just come with you this morning to look at this book of Philemon. I wonder if you've ever seen that program on the television called, I think it's called The Bailiffs Are Coming. If you've ever seen that one. Some of you are looking a little bit blank, so you've probably got no idea at all. Others maybe you do know it. But there is a program anyway called, well, there used to be, I don't know if somehow, there used to be a program called The Bailiffs Are Coming. And it's a program really that follows the work of debt collectors. Their job is to go around visiting people in their homes, collecting and enforcing high court writs. So when anyone is defaulting on their payments and is in debt in some way, these bailiffs will go around and call on their house, and they will literally take away the goods that they've got in their house, anything that's worth anything, and can be resold in order to pay off the debts that these people owe. Sometimes they'll even take somebody's car if it's worth it, or the goods that they've got the right to enter into your home, and they can take what they want, and there's nothing you can do to stop it when these bailiffs come round. And it's a program, of course, about the difficulties and the antagonisms that they face when they're doing their job. And it's well, you've got to say it's a really sad program, isn't it? I mean, you can just imagine, can't you, if you've never seen it? It's a very sad program, really, because it sees people in dire straits normally, people who have hit rock bottom, and yet these debt collectors go around and they'll take whatever they can to pay off the debts. It's very sad, and although you understand that it has to be done, it's a job that somebody's got to do, you do watch that program, at least I do, if I ever see it. You do watch it and you wonder, who on earth would want to do a job like that? There's got to be something very hard-hearted about a person, perhaps. Something, you've got to be tough to do a job like that, haven't you? Someone has said about the bailiffs, a good day for him is a bad day for everyone else. No one is ever happy to receive their warning letters. No one wants to hear the knock on the door when they come. They are like messengers of misery. Who'd want to do a job like that? And yet, there is a sense in which we all do it, don't we? Doesn't someone owe you something? Maybe an apology, or a second chance that you think you deserve, or an explanation for something that they've done and you don't understand it. Maybe they owe you a bit of gratitude. A thank you would be nice. Maybe they owe you love, or a childhood that you were robbed of, or even simply the truth when they've told you a lie. Isn't there something that someone owes you? I'm sure, in a sense, we could probably all, if we wanted to, sit down and make a list of the people that owe us. And there's probably many of them. Parents who should have been more attentive and protective. Children who ought to have been more appreciative of the sacrifices that you've made. A spouse that ought to be more sensitive to your needs. We could go on, couldn't we? We could all spend our lives, if you like, making a list and going around debt collecting, couldn't we? Insisting that our rights are met. Insisting that these debts are paid. People perhaps who even simply not giving you the respect that you think you ought to have received. We can all be debt collectors. But as Christians, we are called not to be debt collectors, but bridge builders. We're called to be peacemakers instead. So you remember in the Lord's Prayer, when the disciples asked him to teach them how to pray, one of the things that he says that they ought to pray is, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, as we forgive our debtors. That's in the Lord's Prayer. It's, in other words, then, this whole matter of either being a debt collector or a bridge builder is, well, there's nothing more important, is there, in a way? And I want to ask the question this morning, are you going to be a debt collector or a bridge builder in your life, in your Christian life? That really is at the heart of this little postcard that Paul writes to Philemon. Philemon has been wronged. One of his slaves has done a runner. His name is Onesimus. And Onesimus seems to have just taken an opportunity and gone. He's run off and seen his opportunity to get away, and he's run off to the big city. And somehow, we don't know how, but somehow, providentially, he has come into contact with the Apostle Paul, who's in prison. It may be that Onesimus was himself arrested for something and put into prison. And there he's come into contact with the Apostle Paul. And while he's been in prison with the Apostle Paul, Paul has preached the gospel to him. And guess what? He's been converted. Paul says in verse 10, I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment. I'll become his dad. I'll become his father, spiritually speaking. Onesimus has been converted. He's my spiritual child now, says the Apostle Paul. And so Paul now writes this letter to Philemon, the owner of this slave. And not only does he write this letter, but he sends Onesimus back to see him. And it's a very personal letter. Paul, in this letter, you could say, I think it's true, that the Apostle Paul really wears his heart on his sleeve in this letter, perhaps in a way that we never see in the rest of the New Testament. It's so personal that you wonder, when you're reading this letter and you really think about what it's saying, it's so personal that you almost feel like an intruder, that you're reading a private letter and you perhaps shouldn't be reading it at all. And then you realise that the letter wasn't just written to Philemon, but to the whole church that met in his house and to his family. There in verse 2, isn't it? Philemon, our brother, fellow worker, beloved fellow worker, and Aphia, our sister. That may have been Philemon's sister as well. And Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the church in your house. So it's not just a personal letter. It is very personal, but it's written to the whole church. And it's a very powerful story. I think, I don't know if you agree, but somebody, can you imagine a slave and the fallout, from that kind of an action? That would be some story to tell when this man is converted and sent back to his owner. Finally, they ought to make a film. But I think here there's a wonderful lesson in this little postcard from the Apostle Paul. I think there's what I want to do with you this morning then is look at this book, but I want to look at it in three different ways. I think that'll be of benefit to us to do that, to look at it in three different ways. I want to think about this book first of all socially, and then spiritually, and then finally specifically. So applying it to us directly. But first of all, then socially. Why look at this book socially? Well, because it raises a very important question, doesn't it? It raises for us the question of slavery and our attitude towards slavery and the Bible's attitude towards slavery. It's such an important theme. I think it's still an important theme today. Some unbelievers will sometimes approach you and say to you something like, when they find out you're a Christian and you tell them a little bit about the Lord or something, they'll come and say something to you like, well, why doesn't the Bible condemn slavery then? Why is the Bible in favour of slavery? Why doesn't Paul here in the book of Philemon take the opportunity to tell us really what he thinks about slavery and just condemn it? Because that would be a lot easier, wouldn't it, they might say. And at first we might look at this book and we perhaps take to heart what they say, these people, and we look at this book and it almost seems to be true. Paul, what does he do? Well, he sends him back to his owner. Incredible, don't you think? He sends him back to his owner. Onesimus belongs to Philemon. That's what it meant to be a bondservant, a slave. Doulos is the word here. It's someone who belongs to another. And this slave has run away. Now, according to the law of the land and the Roman law at that time, Onesimus should have been crucified. That's what they did with runaway slaves, to stop anyone else running away. That was the way they kept their power over the slaves and so on, and how they managed to build up the Roman Empire and so on. It was built on slavery, wasn't it? And lo and behold, incredible as it may seem to us now, Paul, when this young man is converted, what does he do? Well, he says, you've got to go back. You've got to go back to Philemon. He's your owner. It almost seems as though Paul supports slavery, doesn't it? But that is a very superficial way of looking at this passage and indeed approaching this whole question in the New Testament. It's very lazy. The truth of the matter is that Paul does condemn slavery. The New Testament is very clear, really. Come back with me a few pages to 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1. And Paul, here writing to Timothy, who is the pastor in Ephesus at the time, having difficulties with those in the church who were very legalistic and judgmental. And he says this in verse 8, chapter 1 and verse 8. Now, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and their mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. Paul there is telling us what the law is about, what the law is for. And there he's listing for us a whole host of people, or people types, if you like, groups of people in society that really the law is written for. It's for the ungodly, it's for the disobedient, it's for murderers, it's for the lawbreaker, isn't it? And it's for who? Enslavers. Do you see what Paul is saying there? Right back there in the New Testament period, Paul is already saying this is against God's law. He does condemn slavery, doesn't he? And he does exactly the same here in this book of Philemon, but he does it in a very, very subtle way, a very important way. Come back with me to Philemon and look at verse 16. You see what he says? No longer, he's sending him back. Let's read from verse 15. Well, this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever. No longer as a bondservant or slave, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but now much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. You see what Paul is saying there? It's dynamite. Can you imagine that, writing those words in that kind of a setting, in that kind of society where the very Roman Empire was built on slavery? And he writes this word. It's almost like throwing a hand grenade in the house of Philemon. I mean, I'm sure he didn't just have one slave. He probably had many. It sounds like a very rich man. The church, his house is so big enough that the whole church meets in his house. He's a very wealthy man, it seems, and he probably had a number of slaves. But now Paul sends this man back and he says, but he's not a slave anymore, is he? He's your brother. And that makes all the difference. When slaves become brothers with their owners, the whole system breaks down. Can you imagine the church in his home when Onesimus got back? Just imagine the Bible study. On a Tuesday night, they have a Bible study there in Philemon's house. And all the church gathers. They have this Bible study and a prayer meeting. And before Onesimus ran away, well, he was probably out in the kitchen preparing the pizza for afterwards. And getting the tea, well, whatever they drank, the wine or whatever it was, he'd be getting all of this ready and he'd be there at the door waiting for the amen at the end of the prayer meeting. And then coming in and serving all the brothers and sisters their pizza and whatever it was that they had. And then when he'd served all of that, he'd probably retreat to the kitchen again until he was called to come in and get all the plates and the cups and to go and do the washing up and so on. He was a slave. But now he's converted, says Paul. And he's not coming to you as a bond servant anymore. He's a beloved brother to you and to me. So what's he going to do now in the prayer meeting? What's he going to do? Surely he's going to be there, isn't he? He's going to be in the prayer meeting and the Bible study. Surely he's going to be, seeking the opportunity to perhaps give his opinion on some certain verse in the scripture. He's going to be praying in the prayer meeting and so on. He's converted now. He's no longer just a slave that would do things at Philemon's command. He's a brother. He's a brother in the Lord. Now that is massive, isn't it? You think about it. That is revolutionary. And in time, that revolution that was started in the New Testament would literally mean the downfall of the Roman Empire, and would literally eventually lead to the ending of the abolition of slavery in Britain and America and so on, whenever that was, in the 1700s, wasn't it? I think it was this seed of revolution that was being sown. Jesus was a revolutionary. And he was more revolutionary than Spartacus ever was. And he's more revolutionary than Che Guevara or anyone else. He started a revolution that would change the world, but he actually did it from the inside. That's the wonderful thing about his revolution, isn't it? You think about it. What has brought about the greatest change in society over the centuries? What brings about the greatest change now in our society? Is it, signing petitions and marching on Parliament and getting the laws changed in Parliament and so on? Is it perhaps forming great protests and stopping the traffic in London and marching through London and causing? Is that what causes the greatest change, or is it the preaching of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ? I'm sure protest has got its place. I'm not saying it hasn't. And it's not wrong to write to your MP at times. In fact, I did it just a few weeks ago. But those kind of things are limited, aren't they? You may achieve a change in the laws of the land and therefore outward conformity with those laws, but the gospel changes the heart. Old attitudes begin to break down, so that Paul can say in the New Testament there is neither bond nor free, male nor female. There are no divisions. We are one in Christ Jesus. That's glorious. And it's wonderful, to see Philemon's response. There was a response, and we know what it was, really. If you go with me to the end of Colossians, you'll see it, I think. In Colossians chapter 4, let me just read a couple of verses. In chapter 4, verse 7. In his final greetings,